The Empire's navy was built largely around their most famous vessels, Imperial Star Destroyers. Although admittedly they were not the most common ship, ISDs were the backbone of every major offensive force. That being said, the Imperial Navy generally used two types of fleets, Escort Fleets and Superiority Fleets, with the former mostly meant to guard convoys and shipping lanes against pirates and rebels, while the latter would have been used in situations where major force was brought to bear, for example, offensive missions, defense of key sectors and planets, etc. So the rules for today are pretty simple. Using ships the Empire actually had access to, and without dramatically increasing costs, and that's for both money and personnel, we'll be redesigning the Empire's Escort and Superiority fleets. And let's start with Superiority. One thing that I want to do here is keep the ISD as the backbone of the Empire's navy. With that in mind, let's take a look at the lore. Superiority fleets were built around the new Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Officially, each was assigned a battle squadron of 18 smaller ships, but in practice, Star Destroyers were normally accompanied by just 2 or 3 escorts, if any. An Imperial Star Destroyer was designed to operate without support and was too fast for any escorts except the speediest light cruisers. Superiority forces were officially assigned to fleet combat, but were normally used as mobile reserves, projecting Imperial power in response to local threats. So they're basically what you'd expect when you think of a standard Imperial fleet. They primarily project force, respond to major threats, and of course, engage in major fleet combat. I think what we should do is maintain the fleet as structured around a single Imperial Star Destroyer, while better picking ships that can support that ISD, while also catering to the ISD's strength. The Imperial Star Destroyer is over 1.5 kilometers long, it's bristling with weapons, it's incredibly powerful, and can handle essentially any enemy that opponents would throw at it. If that's not the case, then various fleets will be coming together anyway. So my escort ships will be dedicated instead to carrying capacity, anti-fighter support, and perhaps some extra duties, all while being mobile enough to keep up with the Imperial Star Destroyer at near or top speeds. Let's start with anti-fighter/support, and this is where we'll be dedicating the majority of the discussion. There are a few things I would do. Obviously, I need an escort ship, and my primary choice would be the Lancer, but there's an issue. While some sources like the paragraph from X-Wing Rogue Squadron that I like to reference has described the Lancer as being very, very fast, others haven't and have put its top speed as below an ISD. For that reason, and I guess to keep things interesting, let's look at some different ships. On the small side, I would want gunships carried in the hangars of the Imperial Star Destroyer and whatever other vessel had room for them, not instead of fighters, but in addition to them. One option I like is the YE-4, which should be able to dominate fighters and works essentially as a defensive screening vessel. It's loaded with laser cannons which can project fire in every direction. They should be much faster than the larger corvettes and frigates I'm about to discuss, so it would stick close to the Star Destroyer or other key ships and destroy any fighters which broke through. Now, technically, as I mentioned, normal fleets got 18 smaller support ships. I'm not sure if these should technically count, because they can probably be carried in the Star Destroyer, but because they do take up additional manpower and cost, we'll keep that in mind. But aside from gunships, we also want scaled up anti-fighter vessels, and as we get larger, some of the ships will become a bit more versatile. Let's look at the Corvette. I really like, for the Empire at least, the Raider. It's armed with heavy anti-fighter weapons, but also has turbo lasers, ion cannons, and missile launchers, giving it incredible versatility, allowing it to engage both fighters and, if necessary, smaller capital ships. Additionally, the vessel had a small hangar and could carry a couple of fighters. The Raider really nicely complements the Imperial Star Destroyer defensively, but also has the ability to, as the name would suggest, strike out at enemies if the time is right, especially if multiple Raiders work in conjunction. In total, I think I would include maybe 6 of these ships, but would also include 2 CR-92s, which were the more combat-focused variant of the CR-90. If possible, I would outfit them more heavily for anti-fighter support, replacing some of the turbo lasers with laser cannons. I think that's possible because we know Corellian vessels are usually highly modular, with CR-90s being even more so. So that right there is about half of our available support ships. As we move up, we now also have to start worrying about budget constraints. For example, I would like to have something that can support the ISD in anti-capital ship action if needed. Ideally, maybe we have a trio of Victory Star Destroyers, but that's asking a lot. Instead, I think a great, underappreciated Imperial capital ship is the Enforcer. It's essentially an interdictor cruiser, but with power moved from interdiction capabilities to other ship systems, including shielding, weaponry, and engines, making it a very fast and very competent vessel. Enforcers were typically armed with 6 ion cannons, 10 quad lasers, and 10 turbo lasers, making them both offensively and defensively gifted. Although I'd love to have many of these as possible in my fleet, I would probably only have access to 1 or 2. Alongside that, I would like a pair of perhaps carrot cruisers, also very competent vessels, but smaller and dedicated more to anti-capital ship combat. Essentially, these other capital ships are meant to give the ISD more flexibility. They can flank an enemy, attack from multiple angles, etc. I imagine the carracks or enforcers operating together with a detachment of fighters and escort ships like the raiders helping to protect them. Moving these away from the fleet still leaves the Star Destroyer protected, which is key. Moving on though, starfighters are also very important, and I'd want more than just the ISD carrying fighters in their hangars, especially because the Star Destroyer may have to use its carrying capacity for something else, especially if we're launching a ground invasion or something. There's a few issues with this. Most Imperial carriers are either very slow or very big and expensive, like the Secutor, such that they would instead be anchoring the fleet. My ideal choice, and one that I think is at least semi-reasonable, is the Venator, which I've argued is an average multi-role ship, seriously lacking offensive weapons, but is a phenomenal carrier, while still maintaining a reasonable size and being able to keep pace with the ISD. A Venator beautifully complements an Imperial Star Destroyer because when combined with corvettes and frigates, you've basically covered your starfighter carrying, your offensive weaponry, and your anti-starfighter. The Empire mostly wasted Republic ships on backwater planets or scrapping them because they were replaced by the Star Destroyer, which were much more powerful. What they failed to recognize is that Venators could be slotted beautifully into existing Imperial fleets, where they could provide great support and even a bit of turbo laser firepower if needed. If possible, I would find some way to automate the Venator so that crew could be moved to other ships, and it would probably spend most of its time at the rear of the formation. The turbo lasers and even to a degree the laser cannons would mostly just be extras. It's a little tougher if Venators aren't available because the Empire has only a few other carriers. My second choice, I guess, would be Fax. They're very slow, so they run the risk of being left behind in battle, but as long as they can disgorge their fighters, it's fine. Ideally, you'd want at least 2 of these ships, but it depends on what's available. The Gladiator is also a very good all-around capital ship, but because it carries only 24 fighters, it doesn't really work in this situation, where we already have an Imperial Star Destroyer. Actually, now that I think of it, another good carrier option could be the Quasar. As the Essential Guide to Warfare says, it's basically a vast hangar with engines strapped to the back. This thing would never be purposely seen in combat and would remain at the rear of the formation, so as long as it could keep up, that might be another good choice. If I have the remaining money or personnel for extra ships, I would probably just choose Nebulon Bs. As the Essential Guide to Warfare says, the EF-76 was an ungainly combination of weapons, sensors, and tie racks that became the most effective light warship of recent centuries. Now, I do think that latter bit is debatable, but the Nebulon B, design issues notwithstanding, certainly was quite useful, and those sensors possessed do also give the fleet just a bit of extra information about the battlefield, and maybe even facilitates intra-fleet communication. And that's it. That's my superiority fleet. One thing I will say is, when possible, throw an interdictor in there. One of the Empire's greatest problems is that their enemies are always escaping. Try to stop that. That being said, interdictors are very, very expensive. Also, I would use acclimators and other Clone Wars era ships when I need to do any sort of land invasion or even cargo moving. I think the acclimator is hideously ugly, but it has an incredibly fast hyperdrive, it's sturdy, and it's got a lot of space. If the propulsion is good enough and if it was fitted properly, the acclimator could also make a good carrier. But next up we have escort fleets, and I'm going to keep this one very simple. Escort fleets are meant to protect freighters and shipping lanes, while also sometimes taking out small enemy forces and guarding obscure planets. I don't think we know enough about the assets available to a standard escort fleet, but I'm going to assume most ships would be about 300 meters or less. That precludes, say, gladiators and enforcers. So we also need to keep these fleets low on personnel, just to be reasonable. These are backwater worlds we're talking about. So what we're doing here is essentially recreating Rebel fleets. I would want Quasars, Lancers, Carracks, Nebulon Bs, and small gunships all thrown together. Quasars for fighters, Lancers for anti-fighters, Carracks for turbo lasers, and Nebulon Bs and gunships just for extra support. Use whatever funds available and make some combination of those. But guys, that is all I have for today. What do you think of my ideal fleet composition? How would yours differ? Is there a ship that I've left out for a specific category that you'd like to see included? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments section. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great week, and may the Force be with you.